So I'd just like to review a couple of rules and then I'm going to turn it over to our host for this evening, David Armenti, who's another BCHS board member. Um, well, we are recording this evening's program. We will link it on our BCHS YouTube page, which I'll add a link in the chat so that you all can access that later on. We ask that you remain muted during Amy's presentation, just so that she can, articulate what she has planned to say to you all. But we will be offering an opportunity for you to join in the conversation. So look forward to that. And if you have any trouble unmuting or those types of things, like I said, just flag me down. Also, if you have a question during the program, feel free to drop it into the chat. We will be having a question and answer portion. But you can also save those to potentially ask in person. So with all of that said, I'm going to turn it over to David, our host.
Thank you so much, Allison, and to Mike and the rest of the board for making these programs happen. Certainly happy to see everybody here with us this evening. I do want to give just a quick acknowledgement and I guess an apology that unfortunately Sharon Langley was not able to join us this evening. She is a public school educator and got pulled back to her regular in-person instruction duties on short notice earlier this week. And I think we all understand the strain and the challenges that our educators are facing this year. So we would have loved to have had her. It's possible she might tune in a little bit later, but otherwise you're still going to hear the story of how her experience went during this time. And luckily, we still have our wonderful speaker, Amy Nathan, with us, who's going to share a lot about that story here. So I'll just get started then and introduce Amy Nathan, who is just wonderful to have with us here this evening. She's an award-winning author of nonfiction books for adults and young people. That includes the new publication, A Ride to Remember, that we'll be talking about this evening, co-authored with Sharon Langley, which was named one of the best picture books of 2020 by Brown Bookshelf. She also has another new book, Together, an Inspiring Response to the Separate but Equal Supreme Court Decision That Divided America, which describes the reconciliation between the two families linked by the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. But Ride to Remember, that we'll learn more about tonight, is also a follow-up to her adult and teen version that looks at that same episode in civil rights history, Round and Round Together, which many people are probably also familiar with. Amy is a graduate of Harvard with master's degrees from Harvard Graduate School of Education and Columbia's Teachers College. Her other books include Take a Seat, Make a Stand for young readers, as well as books on women's history, music, and dance. And you can learn more about her at amynathanbooks.com, which I'm sure we will ultimately share in the chat for those folks that want to learn more about her wonderful catalog. So through the course of the evening, Amy is going to have some slides, talk about the historical context of the events around the Gwynn Oak Park situation. So she'll be sharing those slides and presentation. We will break for a bit to have some time for Q&A. And then we're also planning to present a recorded reading of the book, which is about 13 minutes long. That's time considering, because I know we will have a lot of folks here that want to either ask questions, but also share what their own experiences and connections were. And I really look forward to hearing that part of the program. So all that being said, I will go ahead and kick it over to Amy.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, for inviting us here tonight to hear about a carousel, which did indeed go, as the title of your program says, from Gwynn Oak to the National Mall. And there are historical markers in both places. One is in Woodlawn, Maryland, where Gwynn Oak Amusement Park used to be, and the other is on the National Mall. So now I'm going to share my screen and just show you some slides to give you a little bit more information on the story of that carousel's journey. Okay, now here we go. I say share and click this. Did it work? It worked. Okay, good. There, so you can see my slide, except for I have to go back a little bit to the first slide of the presentation. There it is. Okay, so yeah, so we're going to tell you a little bit more about the story from these two books. One is A Ride to Remember, a picture book for very young children that was co-authored with Sharon Langley. The other is this book for teens and adults that came out a little earlier in 2011. Sharon and I collaborated on both of these books, and we both grew up in Baltimore, but we didn't meet as children. We didn't connect until 2008 when I read this book by C. Fraser Smith, Here Lies Jim Crow, about segregation in Maryland. And in that book was this picture of Sharon Langley taking a ride at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park in 1963. Now, I write books for young people, and I thought that the story of her ride would make a great picture book for young children. The photo also caught my attention because I never heard about her ride. I lived as a child not far from Gwynn Oak Amusement Park, and I was interested in civil rights. And I went to a magnet high school, Western High School, celebrating its 175th anniversary this year. And that high school drew people from other parts of the city and let me reach out beyond my white Anglo-Saxon Protestant neighborhood of Hunting Ridge. And at Western, I became friends with girls whose families were involved in the civil rights movement. I started to be peripherally involved myself, but I still hadn't known about Sharon's ride. So I tracked Sharon down in California, where she's an educator, and I phoned to ask her, about her memories of that event and her family's memories about that event. And I also asked if it would be okay with her if I did research to write a book for young people about her ride. And she said that was fine, to go right ahead. So that led to this book, Round and Round Together, which came out in 2011. And as you can see, she's right there on the front cover of that book as well. The research for that book made me decide not to turn it into a picture book for very young children, but instead to make it a book for teens and adults. Because the more I learned about the history behind what led to her being able to take that carousel ride, was that this story could really give a good overview of the civil rights movement as a whole, up until the mid-1960s, because the changing strategies that protesters used at Gwynn Oak from 1955 to 1963 pretty much paralleled the shifting tactics that were used in the movement as a whole, as people kept learning more effective ways to deliver their message and win support. I also thought that focusing on a carousel would help people grasp how wide and deep was Jim Crow's reach, that it could even put its grip on such an innocent example of childhood pleasure as taking a carousel ride. And then when my research found that the carousel was now on the National Mall, something that was not mentioned in the Smith book, and that many of the civil rights activists I was interviewing for the book hadn't known either, I saw that this was now a national story, and a pretty little known one at that, because when I contacted the Smithsonian, they had no idea about the civil rights history behind the beautiful carousel that was sitting right there in front of their Arts and Industries headquarters building. Plus, I was learning about so many amazing heroes of the civil rights movement that I knew nothing about as I was growing up in Baltimore. And I thought their story really needed to be known by more people. And so I wanted to help do that by writing about them in this book. Walter P. Carter, Juanita Jackson Mitchell, Senator Verna Welcome, her daughter Mary Welcome, Ed Chance, Reverend Frank Williams, Lily Mae Carroll Jackson, Judges Robert Watts and Robert Bell, Rabbi Morris Lieberman, Marion Bascom, John Romer, Charles Mason, Father Joseph Connolly, Leo Burrows, Bill Moore, and so many, many more. And I'm sure I've left off some of your favorites, but that's just a collection of some of the ones whose stories I really didn't know before I started working on this book. And I was so impressed with what they had done. So I structured the book so it would be of interest to adults, but could also be used in middle schools and high schools because it delivers what I call history in your own backyard. That history isn't something that just happens somewhere else or involves only famous people, but regular people in Baltimore played a role too. And it's wonderful that the Baltimore County Public Schools include the book now in their 7th grade language arts curriculum. And several other Baltimore area schools have used it too. I see someone from Park School is here. Park School has been using the book as well. So finally, in 2013, Sharon and I met at the 50th anniversary celebration of the end of segregation at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. And she came from California to take part in the event. And there she is standing in front of the historical marker that was dedicated at that ceremony at Gwynn Oak, which is now, as you all know, a public recreation area. She spoke at the event, and I was there too, as you see on the other side of the screen, giving away 200 copies of Round and Round Together, thanks to a very generous grant from J.P. Grant, whose mother and cousin helped desegregate Gwynn Oak Park. And his cousin, Lydia Wilkins, I see, is here on the call, and we're going to be hearing from her a little bit later in the program. So that's when Sharon and I decided that we really had to find a way to tell this story for very young children in a picture book. And you're going to be hearing that story soon, read by a really amazing person. We were so sad that Sharon couldn't be here to read it because she reads it so beautifully. But we did a program in Connecticut on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And Renee Goldsberry, who is a star of Hamilton on Broadway, lives in Weston, Connecticut, and she volunteered to read the book for us. So we have a video of her reading the book that we're going to show a little bit later. But first, I want to just get a quick rundown of some of the history of Gwynn Oak. And I know that a lot of you already know that history, so I'm a little nervous about telling the history, but maybe there's some of you here who still don't know this history of Gwynn Oak Amusement Park and the new carousel that arrived there in 1947. And here are some photographs of Gwynn Oak Amusement Park in the 1940s. And you'll notice that all the people in the photographs are white. And that's because right from the very start in 1894, it was a whites only amusement park, as were most amusement parks in the South and some up north too. So the history of this park parallels the Jim Crow era, because 2 years after the park was founded was the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal case at the Supreme Court, which established the legal underpinning of the Jim Crow era by giving its stamp of approval to separate but equal, that it was okay to separate people by skin color as long as the separate facilities for Black people were equal to the facilities for white people. But as we all know, that was never true. And so this shows one example of Jim Crow, but there were so many more, which you all know about. And people protested against Jim Crow right from the very beginning. And I make that point in the book. And I include examples of protests against Jim Crow segregation that happened in Maryland right from the very beginning. But for a really major breakthrough that had a direct impact on Gwynn Oak Amusement Park, it was the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, overturned the idea of separate but equal. And Baltimore was one of the first southern cities to go along with the Brown decision, desegregated its schools the next year, and that fall, and the following summer, protests began at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. So now you might wonder, why would you have protests in an amusement park when there were so many more important issues to deal with, like the quality of the education at the newly integrated schools or housing and jobs? Well, activists were working on those issues too. But Martin Luther King Jr. Explained why it was important to even desegregate amusement parks in his letter from Birmingham City Jail, which he wrote earlier in 1963. And in it he said, and we include that quote in Round and Round Together, "When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her little eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, Then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. And so the very next summer, the next year, protests started at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. That was because of what Dr. King said, but also because of what the Baltimore Sun had found in the survey in March of 1955, that despite the schools being officially desegregated, 91% of businesses in Baltimore were still segregated. Now, the first protest that occurred at Gwynn Oak occurred on September 4th. And that, to give you a little bit of context for that, that was 3 months before Dr. King made his first appearance as a leader of the civil rights movement. It was also, sadly, the first day that news of Emmett Till's death a few days earlier in Mississippi appeared in Baltimore newspapers. So that sort of gives you a context. This was pretty early in the modern civil rights movement. But that first protest didn't work. And neither did protests for the next 7 years. They were organized by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, an interracial group that believed in Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent protest. But they really believed in it, and they really believed that if they just explained the hypocrisy of segregation, that the amusement park would say, oh my gosh, that's terrible, we will drop segregation. But of course, that didn't happen. It took a while for Baltimore CORE to embrace some of the other parts of Gandhi's strategy, which was to create crisis and get very good publicity. So for the first 7 years, their strategy was to protest usually just about once a year. And the protests were small, just a few dozen picketers picketing outside the amusement park. They didn't get much press coverage. They had created no crisis, no drama, no inconvenience for the park's owners. So there was no need for the park's owners to change. So their strategy just wasn't working. But people in Baltimore, particularly Morgan State College students and younger leaders of CORE, began to learn from the strategies that were proving more effective down south, and the Montgomery bus boycott and the lunch counter sit-ins that started in North Carolina, and in 1961, the Freedom Rides. And those tactics included having lots of protesters and getting good newspaper and TV coverage. TV coverage was new. Exerting some economic pain on the segregators, persistence, not just doing it once a summer, but steadily, and creating a sense of crisis, and from the Freedom Rides, mass arrests. So these strategies all came to Baltimore thanks to young people, Morgan State College students and younger members of CORE, who teamed up from 1961 to 1963 and had protests against sit-ins at restaurants all over the state of Maryland every weekend from 61 to 63. And those protests pretty much worked, because in 1962, Baltimore passed a public accommodations law that ended segregation in restaurants and hotels. And the next year, Maryland had a similar law, but only applied to some counties. But neither law applied to amusement parks. And then Morgan State College students gave an example of mass arrests in their protest at Northwood Theater in February of '63 at a segregated movie theater across from the Morgan campus. And more than 1,500 protesters took part, and over 350 were arrested, totally crowding the Baltimore jails, overwhelming city officials, and causing such difficulty for city officials that they pressured the theater's owners to end segregation, and they did. And voting rights played a part in this, because Morgan students, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, had been signing up Black voters. And that's why the mayor was very eager to get this movie theater problem solved, because he was up for re-election. And he knew that JFK would not be president without Maryland, and would have not have won Maryland without the Black vote. So the theater desegregated, but that mayor, Philip Goodman, did not win re-election. Theodore McKeldin won instead, who was a longtime supporter of equal rights. So in July 1963, CORE decided to use all these new strategies at Gwynn Oak. They had two huge demonstrations, one on a very attention-getting day, which was bound to get them some good publicity. And they worked very hard to get the press there to give them the good publicity, the 4th of July. The second protest was 3 days later. And this time they rounded up a lot of co-sponsors, churches, synagogues, unions, civil rights organizations, and hundreds of demonstrators showed up at Gwynn Oak, and children were there too. And in a stroke of good luck, a month before the demonstration, the National Council of Churches and the Central Conference of American Rabbis decided it was time for clergy to do more than preach against segregation, but they needed to get out on the picket line too. And the Archdiocese was also on board. They had announced a boycott of Gwynn Oak the year before. So nearly 400 protesters were arrested, including more than 20 clergy, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. And this was a first for the civil rights movement, for so many clergy to be arrested at a single demonstration of all three major faiths, or so the New York Times said. And Kit's part, getting the clergy arrested really guaranteed good press coverage, and so did involving children. And there was photographs in the Baltimore Sun of Professor James Coleman, his wife Lou, and their three sons. I hope one of their sons is with us tonight who can talk a little bit about this. Their photograph was in the paper. I mean, can you imagine denying a family a visit to an amusement park because of segregation? But there was also a story about Lydia Wilkins and her aunt, who were rounded up by the Afro-American newspaper to try to sneak into the park before the second day of the protest, early before the protesters arrived, because they figured the ticket takers would be so nervous about the protest that was about to happen that they might not look closely at them and not notice that they were actually African Americans. So they spent about an hour at the park. They went on some rides, including the carousel, and then they left before the protesters came, and they told their story to an Afro reporter who wrote it up and pointed out that nothing bad had happened at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park because Lydia had gone on some rides there. So the pressure from all that publicity in the newspapers and pressure from elected leaders and threats of more demonstrations had got the amusement park owners to negotiate, and within 2 weeks, they came to a solution that the park would be open to all on August 28, 1963, the date of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. And the first African-American family to walk into the park was the Langleys, Charles Langley and his wife, and little Sharon, who was 11 months old. Now, you'll hear more about her ride when we read the picture book to you. But the next day, there were photographs of her in the newspaper, along with all the news about the March on Washington. And as you know, the very next year, just almost a year later from the protests at Gwynn Oak, was the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. And then following that was the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Law, which marked the official end of Jim Crow. Although, as we all know, the Jim Crow's legacy lingers on and still causes trouble for all of us today. But the official end of the Gwynn Oak Amusement Park happened shortly after the end of Jim Crow. Many white people refused to go to Gwynn Oak after it desegregated. The park had financial problems, but what really did in the park was Hurricane Agnes. But the carousel survived and was bought by a concessionaire for the Smithsonian and moved to the National Mall in 1981. But as I said, he didn't know the civil rights history of the ride, and neither did the officials that I contacted at the Smithsonian until after my book came out. But then they just were really very impressed with the story, and they embraced it, and they installed a historical marker there, and they looked at historical photographs to identify which horse Sharon rode as a little girl, and they took it off of the ride for a while to decorate it with the names of civil rights heroes, and they put Sharon's name on the horse too. Her name is on the back of the saddle and on one of the horseshoes, and there she is visiting the carousel in 2014. So you'll soon hear more about her ride and what it meant to her when we read the picture book to you. And the picture book is told from the point of view of her as a 6-year-old, because as such a little girl, 11 months old, she doesn't have any personal memories of having been on that carousel when she was a little girl. But so the story is framed as her parents explaining it to her when she was sick, because she actually loved Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. Once she was able to go there, it was one of her favorite things to do. And when her parents had to tell her, well, before you were born, things weren't so great at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. And so as they explain it to her, then the book's young readers can learn the story too. And as she says at the end of the book, in the back matter section, that this book shows that everyone, including children, can play a part in creating a world where all are welcome and treated fairly. And we have some good art activities that kids can do, and they're in the discussion and activity guide that's available on the publisher's website. Activities that can let children think about what change they would make if they can change the world. So we're going to unshare my screen now and maybe get some questions from all of you, and then we'll hear Renee Goldsberry read the picture book, and then we'll hopefully hear from some of you, hopefully from Lydia Wilkins and maybe one of the Coleman brothers and others who may be here who took part in these protests and have strong memories about it. Now, if I can figure out how to stop share. I stopped it. There we go.
Excellent. Yes. So we'll take some time here. I'm going to try to cap it at 8:15 so we can kind of stay on target here. So we'll take this time for questions about the historical context that we've learned, and then we will go to the recording that Amy mentioned. And then I think towards the end, maybe we'll have time for more of those kind of personal reflections and those that might have had those connections to the events. But I can get it started with some of the questions that have appeared in the chat. In the meantime here, Amy, somebody was wondering, who were those people that were protesting at the very beginning? So in the mid 1950s, before kind of the more clergy and kind of the more publicity came on the events, do we know who those people were in the early years?
Yeah, those were members of CORE. It was a small group, a very dedicated group of local Jewish and non-Jewish, Black and white. It was an interracial group, and they never had more than a few dozen. I mean, some of you are probably here who could answer that question better than I can, who were probably there and part of it. But they really had believed in the purity of the Gandhian method, that they really, and they protested at something that was called the All Nations Day Festival, which was supposed to feature representatives from all nations. And so they invited people to come from the different embassies and wear their native costume and bring native foods and sing native songs, but they never invited people from African nations, and they never invited African Americans. So they thought it was just clear the hypocrisy of having an All Nations Day festival and not allowing people from all nations to be there. But it didn't make any difference to the Price brothers who owned Gwynn Oak at that time. They had to really apply pressure, in economic pressure. And probably the major thing was the boycott by the archdiocese, because picnics and parties by the parochial schools was a major source of their income at the amusement park, along with other parties too. So, and that was one reason that they were reluctant to desegregate, because they thought all those groups would stop coming. And it is true, a lot of them did stop coming. So one person that I mentioned on the list of heroes was Father Connolly, who was, he came up with the solution to persuade the Prices to desegregate, that he promised, and he said he and the other clergy would promise to get them bookings. They would get them picnics and parties that would bring in revenue for the park if they desegregated. So, yeah.
Thank you. And another question that came through, a little bit more specific. Did you have a chance to interview a Jaretha Joyner who died in 2015?
No, I didn't. Do you know her story? You want to share her story with us? That would be great.
I think that's an Ed question, if you want to chime in. Or I can read what you wrote, Ed. It's up to you.
Okay.
Why don't you just read?
Sure. So Ed shared with us that there was a specific case in 1959 at Gwynn Oak. He said the protesters were eventually removed from the park.
Oh, the ones that were arrested. Oh, she was one of the ones that was arrested. Yeah, I didn't interview her, but that's in the book, that they're being arrested. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just read their names in case folks are interested. It was 5 people who were arrested. Jaretha Jordan, who was later Jaretha Joyner, and James Lacey, both of whom were Black. Dale Drews, Joseph Sheehan, and Helen Brown, who were white, and they were charged with disorderly conduct. So that's a specific case from 1959.
Yeah, but really, it's so amazing that that happened, and they were removed very roughly and very rudely, but even that didn't earn them much publicity in the local newspapers. So they really had to find. Oh, looking for the picture of that. I'll look for the picture of that in the book, and I can show it to you all. Yeah. Oh, here it is. Here they are. So it's on page 72 of the book. I don't know if you can see it or not, but yeah, they were sort of looks a little bit like what people are doing today to sort of manhandling people. And then people were arrested in a way like that at the second day of the protest. They tried to sneak over into the park from the back entrance and were arrested there. There was a creek in the back of the park, and they were arrested, and people threw rocks at them. And one woman, Allison Tourage Brown, you can see she was hit in the face with a rock, and that's Rabbi Arthur Wasco. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a famous graduate of City College, and he at the time was finishing his dissertation on protest movements, and he was very scared because he knew that once they began to attack you, then they might kill you. And so he had learned that from his research. So he was very scared. And he said they were all marching off to the police vans singing, "We shall overcome," one verse of which is, "We are not afraid." And he said, but we were very much afraid. But there they were. And so he now is a sort of like an official protester. He gets arrested regularly protesting, and he's a leader of an active civil rights. He then became a rabbi and is a very activist rabbi based in Philadelphia. Yeah.
And thank you, Amy, and not a question, but I think a very significant comment that just came in through the chat from one of our former History Evening speakers, Linda Morris. It should be noted that Governor Spiro Agnew took his stand at the park that Gwynn Oak would not be desegregated, and chastised Mrs. Juanita Mitchell, daughter of Lily Carroll Jackson, regarding the demonstrations. This act gained him the prominence that brought him to the attention of Richard Nixon and his Law and Order platform, and led to Agnew being nominated for vice president. So for those that don't know, right, Spiro Agnew, prior to being vice president, was the Baltimore County executive, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah, so I think he was against it at first, but then he came around for it because he was trying to promote Baltimore County as a good investment, a place for businesses to come and invest. And seeing people arrested by the police around segregation, they were trying to point that they weren't the South, and this was a good place to come and do business. So he actually then changed and became quite a strong. He wanted them to the park to give in, and and to solve this problem and not have any more disturbances that would ruin Baltimore County's reputation. So yeah, so a complicated story on his part, but yeah, he was.
And I see a lot of activity in the chat around people making personal connections, which is really cool to see. And again, I think we'll save that kind of discussion part of the conversation for the later end of the program. But
and I say that John Coleman is here. He was one of the little boys who was arrested.
Wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
And a question just came through: was Gwynn Oak in Baltimore County?
Yeah, it was. It was just over the county line in Woodlawn.
Right, and as Amy mentioned earlier, that's still a public park there, and you can go visit, and you can see the plaque that commemorates these events that occurred there. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and share screen so we can hear from Amy. You want to prompt it again? Who we're going to hear from doing the reading?
It's Renee Elise Goldsberry, who was one of the stars of Hamilton on Broadway, and so she graciously read it at a nature center in Western Connecticut that had a big celebration for Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
A Ride to Remember by Sharon Langley, Amy Nathan, illustrated by Coretta Scott King Award winner Floyd Cooper. A Ride to Remember, a Civil Rights Story. My book is signed. Okay. I love carousels. The horses come in so many colors: black, white, brown, gray, a honey shade of tan, sunny yellow, fire engine red, or even a soft baby blue. But no matter their colors, the horses all go at the same speed as they circle round and round. They start together, they finish together too. Nobody is first and nobody is last. Everyone is equal when you ride a carousel. When I was a very little girl, my family lived in Baltimore. Near our house was an amusement park. It was green and grassy, big and beautiful, bright and shiny. There were rides and games, treats and cold drinks at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park, and a carousel too. But before I was born, there were no rides or sweets at that park for children like me. Was it because kids didn't have money to buy tickets? I asked Mama. No, it wasn't about money, said Mama. Or was it because they lived too far away from the park? I asked. That wasn't the problem either, said Daddy. And why? I wondered aloud. It was because of an unfair rule the park had, Daddy explained. The rule said that African Americans couldn't go on any of the rides. Could we go there to have a picnic or fly a kite? I asked. No, we couldn't, said Mama.
Make the picture smaller.
Would have been welcome there, said Daddy. That's terrible, I said. Yes, it was, Mama said. It was segregation, keeping people apart because of their race, treating people differently because of the color of their skin, Daddy added. What about the golden rule? I asked. What about treating other people the way you want to be treated? I guess some people forgot that the golden rule is supposed to include everyone, said Mama. For a long time, Black and white kids couldn't do many things together. They couldn't go to the same schools or to the same restaurants and libraries or even sit together at the movies. It was the law. Why didn't somebody do something about those kind of laws? I asked. They did, said Mama. We did, said Daddy. Many people, both blacks and whites, knew that segregation was unfair and just plain wrong. Some people said, just wait, times will change. But others said, why wait? What's Wrong with Now? They held protests at restaurants, stores, and movie theaters. They tried to get officials and courts to make new laws to create a better city, a place that would welcome and include all people. By the time I was born, some unfair laws had changed in Baltimore. Kids could go to the same schools and libraries, restaurants, and some movie theaters too, no matter the color of their skin. But the amusement park just wouldn't budge, said Daddy. People who were fed up with segregation made plans to hold a huge protest at the amusement park. They spread the word to churches, synagogues, schools, and other places in the community so that people, many people, could take part in the protest. They invited newspapers and television stations to report on the protest. They told the police chief about their plans so the police could keep the peace. Best of all, they picked a perfect summer day for the big event, a day when people celebrate what's best about America, said Mama. What day do you think they chose? The 4th of July, I said. That's right. A day that stands for freedom, said Mama. Did they have fireworks, I asked. They had something even better. Hundreds of people, black and white, young and old, students, teachers, priests, ministers, and rabbis, all came together on July 4th, 1963, to take part in one of the biggest protests the city ever had, said Daddy. They believed in the golden rule, that being fair is the right thing to do, said Mama. First, the protesters went to a church to pray, sing freedom songs, and get ready. They spent the morning learning how to be peaceful protesters, how not to use their fists to fight back. Then they climbed onto buses to go to the amusement park. They brought signs and banners that declared their message of fairness for all. When the protesters reached the park, a crowd of angry faces greeted them, people who didn't want the park to change. They shouted insults at the protesters. The protesters just held their signs high and sang freedom songs. We shall overcome. The civil rights anthem filled the air, said Daddy. But when they tried to go into the park to buy tickets, blacks and whites together, the park's owners had the protesters arrested, said Mama. So they did what they had been taught to do, protest peacefully. Some sat down on the ground and refused to move. Police officers had to carry them to buses to take them to the police station. Mama and Daddy explained that almost 300 protesters were arrested that day. Some paid a fine and could go home, but half refused to pay their fines. They chose to spend the night in jail instead. When they went home the next day, they began planning another protest for 2 days later, on July 7th. Kids helped too, Mama said. A newspaper reporter even asked 11-year-old Lydia Finney and her aunt, Mabel Grant, to go on a secret protest at the park. They both had light-colored skin. He thought the park's ticket taker might not know they were black. On the morning of the second protest, Lydia and her aunt walked up to the ticket booth. They bought tickets and walked right in. They could have been arrested if anyone found out who they were, but nobody noticed. They stayed for 2 hours and went on some rides, including the carousel. When they left, the protesters weren't there yet, but the reporter was. He interviewed them and wrote about their visit to show what a mistake it is to judge people by the color of their skin. When the protesters arrived for the second protest, police arrested nearly 100 protesters, blacks and whites, who tried to enter the park together. Among the youngest taken to the police station were 3 young white boys who joined the protest with their parents, Tom, John, and Steve Coleman. Photos of those boys and their parents being arrested and put in a police car appeared in newspapers the next day. Those photos shocked many people, said Mama. Arresting a family for trying to ride a carousel. Ridiculous, I said. Exactly, said Mama. Stories about the protests in newspapers and on television made more people decide that segregation had to go. So many people spoke out against the park, that its owners saw that they had to change. So many people spoke out against the park, that its owners saw that they had to change. The park's owners agreed to let everyone come to the park, no matter their skin color. All arrest charges against the protesters were dropped too. The first day Gwynn Oak Amusement Park was open to all was August 28, 1963. 1 month before my first birthday. Mama told me that at first she was afraid to take me to the park. Would we be safe? Would we be arrested? But she and Daddy decided that it was important for us to be there that first day as a family. On August 28, 1963, we were the first African-American family to walk into Gwynn Oak Amusement Park when it was open to all. No angry faces greeted us, only smiling news reporters and photographers who rushed around us. Daddy said he marched me straight over to the carousel. He helped me onto a big smiling horse. He put his arm around me and held my hand so I wouldn't be afraid. Mama stood nearby, waving. Photographers jumped onto the ride with us. They took photos of Daddy and me because I was the first African-American child to go on a ride that day. Before the carousel started turning, white kids climbed onto the horses beside me. They were big kids and could probably ride by themselves. But one girl's mother asked Daddy to keep an eye on her daughter to make sure she didn't fall off her horse. Daddy was glad to help. He kept watch on all us kids, keeping all of us safe. The next day, newspapers had stories about my carousel ride. There was my name, Sharon Langley, right in the newspaper. There were photos of Daddy and me and of the other kids riding with me. It had been a big new day for everyone who was at the amusement park with us. August 28 was also an important day for a man who was trying to end unfair rules everywhere, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On that very day, Dr. King was at a huge protest in Washington, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Hundreds of thousands of people joined him to call for an end to segregation everywhere. Dr. King told the crowd about his hopes and dreams, that one day Black children and white children would live together peacefully in this country, treating each other as brothers and sisters. My carousel ride showed that Dr. King's dream was starting to come true. Oh, that was a long time ago. The amusement park isn't there anymore. A big storm destroyed many of the rides and Gwynn Oak Amusement Park had to close. Now it's a park where families have picnics on sunny afternoons and where neighborhood kids play ball. On its green grassy field stands a sign to help people remember those who took a stand for justice there. Carousel came through the storm just fine and was moved to Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. It's fitting that it should be there, near the monuments that stand for freedom, not far from the Lincoln Memorial where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood to give his famous speech during the March on Washington. My name, Sharon Langley, was put on one horse's saddle and on one of its horseshoes too. It's right there. A sign on the carousel's fence tells about my ride to remember on that sunny August day so long ago. Today, big kids, little kids, young kids, old kids, no matter the color of their skin, can ride on any carousel going round and round on horses painted all the colors of the rainbow. Nobody first and nobody last. Everyone equal, having fun together. The end. Who's that beautiful lady?
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed that. And it's worth noting that there on those last couple of pages, right, Amy, there's a timeline, there's more historical context for, readers and families that might be utilizing the book. Certainly not as widely with the historical documentation like your other book, Round and Round Together, is, but a good kind of primer for groups that might want to use it with younger learners. And if I might just offer from my personal experience, I got my copy of the book right here, and I did actually read it to my oldest daughter, who at the time was 4 and is now 5, and it's just such a powerful experience to see that understanding in a young person's head, even at that young age, trying to comprehend it. And it's powerful, it's painful, but I do think it's an opportunity, and it's really a necessary thing to, even early on, start to bring that home, that these events happen in our country, and how that really shows how unfair things used to be, and how some of that challenge still is with us today. But anything else you wanted to start us with about that, Amy, before we maybe get into some questions and other comments from the audience?
Yeah, people might be interested now that they've seen the pages about Lydia Wilkins and John Coleman. They're both here on the chat. They could maybe talk a little bit about what taking part in that event as young children meant to them. Because actually, in just 1 month before the park was opened at those July protests, there were people who were throwing rocks, and there was, a lot of hostility, and on the March on Washington, the Ku Klux Klan, whose headquarters was not too far from Woodlawn, from where in the Maryland headquarters, they were threatening to cause trouble at the March on Washington. So Sharon's mother was scared to go, and her husband persuaded her that it was really important for them to go and be there. So it'd be interesting to hear what impact it had on Lydia and John Coleman. Are you both still there, Lydia and John?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I think actually all the Coleman boys are here.
Oh, great!
Are here.
Oh, great! Well, can you just take time to talk to us a little bit about what it was like, your mother?
John, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. Both our mom and dad took us to the park, but the story goes that it was really our mom that instigated the trouble, and I teased her throughout her life that she used us as human shields, and I think that's evidenced by the pictures where she's holding Steve in front of her as she's getting dragged off to the police car. So, but yeah, the three of us are on the call, and then a number of her grandchildren are on the call also, under Becky Abel there. Sam is there, and I think Cora Allen Coleman is here also. Unfortunately, another grandchild is off in Europe, and it's the middle of the night. But I did want to emphasize that, you know, that protest was not the end of our mother's involvement in the civil rights. She didn't make it to the opening of the amusement park because she was at the March on Washington, and she was pretty traumatized by some protests that occurred somewhat later, and I'm not, maybe my brothers know better exactly when it was, but she was threatened with her life, and that really intimidated her quite a bit. But she continued to support civil rights throughout her life, and I worked for the Chippewa Indians in Wisconsin, and in the 90s there was a lot of protest against them fishing on lakes in northern Wisconsin, and there was they were shot at and a lot of rocks thrown. And our mom came out here and stood with me at the boat landings to act as human shields between the protesters and the Chippewa Indians. So she was, throughout her life, she really believed in civil rights, and she loved Amy's books about the Gwynn Oak Park events, and all the way up to her death this February, she was giving out those books like candy canes. And a number of folks that worked at the assisted living facility here in Wisconsin where she died requested copies of Round and Round Together because they had small children, and she was thrilled to give those books out to those folks. So my brothers might have additional things. Tom's a little bit older, so he probably remembers the actual arrest better.
Yeah, I just remember they, you know, taking us off in a police car so that there would not be any problem with sort of issues from the counter protesters. Yeah, it's quite an event.
And Steve probably doesn't actually remember much about it. He was 6 months old at the time.
I don't think Steve can remember.
I do not remember much about it, but I certainly remember the stories about it. And I was retrospectively very excited to have been there.
Yeah. So Allison, I don't know if you would let me share a picture. I have another picture of our, of Steve actually and our mother.
Sure. Let me just change the setting here so that you can share. Now you should be able to share your screen, Tom.
So yes, I think this is from if you can see it, I think this must be from the Baltimore Sun from the next day. But there is Steve being carried again as a human shield. And I think we're all being escorted to a police car to take us off and, to the armory to spend the night in the armory.
One thing I'd like to add is that it really inspired our family. Her grandchildren have been involved in civil rights issues here in Wisconsin. They stood up for labor and teachers' rights when the state legislature was trying to, or successfully, unfortunately, passed laws to deprive unions and teachers of a lot of rights. And they really continued to carry the flag. So that event back in 1963 was really an inspiration for generations of people in our family.
Great. And we have this a wonderful show that she did, that Lou Coleman did. It was a wonderful program that they did around in libraries and senior centers in Baltimore in the early 200s, like around 2012, 2013, 2014, done by Baltimore, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. It was called For All the World to Hear. We probably don't have time tonight to show it, but I think Allison can put a link to the video in the chat. It's worth watching if you have time. But the one that shows Luke Coleman is in, if you click on the link that Allison's going to give you, if you click on that one, it takes you to recordings of a whole performance of these senior citizens who are recalling their experiences with prejudice and segregation during their lives. And Luke Coleman speaks in the one that's part 4 of 4. So if you want to just listen to that one, she talked about how her husband wanted to take the boys canoeing that day, and she said, "Oh no, let's take them and go get arrested instead." That was her decision. So we also have Lydia Coleman here, who has participated in a lot of panel discussions about the Gwynn Oak story, and
Lydia Wilkins.
Lydia Wilkins, Lydia Finney Wilkins, right? Yeah. Lydia, you there? Can she unmute?
So Amy, this is Carla. My mom might just be having issues trying to figure out how to get off of mute.
So this is Lydia's daughter. So both Lydia and Carla took part in this wonderful program that was done by the Monarch Academy Charter School in Glen Burnie. A wonderful teacher there, John J.P. Bennett, had people like Lydia and Carla, and I think Luke Coleman came and did it one year, and Charles Mason and John Romer. A lot of these people who took part in the protest came down there, and the students would interview them, and they videotaped the interviews. And I think for a couple of years, they donated the videotaped interviews to the Maryland Historical Society, and they are in the archives, the oral history archives of the Maryland Historical Society. So if you want to go there, you can look it up and ask the archivist. They can find it for you. And both Carla and her mother would be interviewed together. I just always loved. I had the pleasure of sitting there and listening to them a couple of times, and then I listened to the videos later. That they're really worth listening to. Well, maybe Lydia will figure out how to unmute soon and can come in. But what do you remember about what she told you about it?
I do remember that she says that she doesn't remember much, just very much that she was afraid, because she was, I think, 11 when she went in there, and she was just always worried that someone would notice, and that she knew she just couldn't enjoy what was going on. And that's what she probably remembers most, and being afraid of it.
Mm. Yeah.
And just all the issues within school and other instances when, they'd come into her classrooms and ask her, was she the only colored one in her classroom? And, no one knew until then really that she was. And then not that she was trying to pass, it just didn't come up. So then everybody knew. But yeah, just fear probably the most. And my nephew has been on that same carousel recently, and hopefully one day my daughter will get there. This little one over here. Say hi, Lana. There we go.
Yeah, I asked the Smithsonian, so when is the carousel going to open again? And they said they hope soon, but they're just following the instructions of the safety experts. So it's still there. You can go and see it. You just can't ride on it yet. So I think they're being very cautious on the Smithsonian museums in general, because if you open them up, they're always mobbed. So it'd be really hard to restrict people to social distancing in the Smithsonian Institution museums. That's for sure.
I wonder if there are any Glick reminiscences here.
Yeah, are there other people who have were at the protest and remember doing it?
Chris, if you want to unmute, or Barbara, if you guys want to share.
Yeah, I remember being at a protest with my brother, John, who's also on this And I think it was 1962 or earlier in 1963 that we were on that. And then another thing I remember is our father was an adamant practitioner of the golden rule, and he like drilled that into us constantly. So when we were at this protest, I guess he got an article, a letter to the editor at the Sun, and he talked about his kids. He may have mentioned our names, I can't remember. But John remembers.
John, can you unmute? John.
Okay, I think
Yes.
I unmuted.
You did.
Good. Yay.
Great.
Yeah, I remember going there and being spit upon, and when we were walking and having rocks thrown and people cursing at us and what. And I also remember that those years I went into Baltimore City with some Black friends of mine, and we went into, I think it was a White Tower and other restaurants and stores, and sat down and got thrown out, and did things like that. And I remember belonging to CORE back then too. Doing many protests. I remember downtown doing a big march in Baltimore. But yeah. Yep.
Yeah, we did a lot of that back then, and we had friends that were Black or whatever, and we never really, we just always thought of including whoever was our friends and whatever we did, and people used to call me names because I'm Jewish, but I remember that stuff. It's pretty awful to have lived through, but on the other hand, it's great to have lived through because we can talk about it, and it's so good that this group is talking about this, because that's what we need to talk about in this country. Really happy to be here.
I'd like to say one thing, because I was a few years younger, but I certainly remember my brothers going to the park and protesting, and I remember we loving to go, we loved going to Gwynn Oak Amusement Park as well. And I also remember Carlson's swimming pool, and we stopped going there to protest the segregation. That's what I remember. My brothers might remember it differently.
No, that's right, we did. Yeah. And that was really a fun place. And we stopped. I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
That's wonderful. Are there other people who have memories of Gwynn Oak or that era?
I have just a quick memory of the Oriole Cafeteria, which some of you may remember was on York Road, and also a very segregated restaurant. And as a 16-year-old, I was working, doing something, and my early experience with segregation was the African-American people my age were, of course, doing not the serving and sort of removal of trays, but I, just being a kid, would eat lunch with them, and the white ladies would say to me, why are you eating with them? And, I think it's wonderful for those of us who are as old as we are to maybe have experienced some of the horrors of racism that have existed in our culture for centuries. And being white, being fortunate enough to be able to recognize it and maybe even speak to it at that time, which I did just by telling her I liked sitting with the people I was sitting with, and that was kind of all there was to it. But this undercurrent of systemic racism that we've all grown up with is where we need to continue to push back against. But thank you, Amy Nathan, for that for the wonderful book, which communicates these ideas so well to young kids. I'm an educator.
Oh, great.
I taught second grade for years, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that was Sharon's idea to frame it around the idea of the golden rule, because she said that's how her parents explained it to her. Why you treated people well was because you just did, you know, and she uses that when she tries to explain it, because she teaches elementary school students as well. So it's a pretty easy idea you grasp, and if you really grasp it, then there's really that's all you need to know. But unfortunately, that isn't always the way it is. And we also saw that the carousel itself was like a metaphor for this, because especially on this carousel in Washington, they really have painted all the horses every color of the rainbow, and so all the horses are going around the same speed. They start together, they end together. They're all the same. No winners, no losers when you ride a carousel. And so it's the same metaphor of people. Shouldn't be any winners or losers. People are people. So I'm hoping that it might embed in children's minds that anytime they see a carousel, they'll say, "Oh, I remember that story about little Sharon in the carousel." So maybe it'll help them have a sense of moving sideways from that experience to other experiences of discrimination and othering, and maybe it might make them more sensitive to that. I don't know. Maybe that's too much to expect of a picture book, but you never know. So that was sort of one of our hopes for the book too.
And I do want to continue to welcome feedback from our participants here in the last 10 minutes or so, but I did want to go back to a question that appeared in the chat, Amy, that maybe you can enlighten a little bit about the role that television played in the publicity of the Gwynn Oak protest that took place. And were there among the protesters people that sought out that had that specific role to seek out media attention, or, you know, maybe what was the strategy there? Because you mentioned in the early years, maybe they didn't have as much, and that's part of what made it more effective.
Yeah, I know that they made a big effort to tell the press that they were doing this and to get them there. Whether there were any people that were specifically, there's a wonderful man who I'd hoped might be here, but he said his wife was ill, Charles Mason, who was very active in the protests and also participated in all those recording sessions for both for the Monarch Academy, and also he has done oral histories for the Reginald Lewis Museum about his experiences at Gwynn Oak. So he said he had a little sports car, and he had tons of flyers about the protest, and he just drove around Baltimore for the week before the protest and handing out flyers to anybody, you know, all the stores he could think of. You know, so I think he was a one-man publicity agency. He was a member of CORE. So it's too bad he could have answered that question more. I don't know whether anyone during the protest was specifically. And then at the first protest, he was hit in the head with a rock, and they had to go to the hospital to get stitches. And so he was sort of sidelined for a while. But there is really good footage on this at the University of Baltimore. Has an archive that has very good footage of the protest itself. And for anyone who wants it, if you write to me, care of my website, I can send it to you. I mean, you just have to not sell it to anybody or put it in anything and turn it into a movie or anything. But if you just want to see it or show it to a school group or some kind of a community group, you know, that's fine. But yeah, so there were the the people who look just like the Proud Boys now, the white shirts, the black pants, marching and saying, Gwynn Oak for white people, march on the other side of the street, and the protesters were on this side. They worked very hard with the police department to keep it, to tell them what they were going to do. And so the police department made plans to have school buses there to bring people from it was really organized. This was very organized, whereas their earlier things were totally not organized. But this time they were really organized. And so they wanted to try to minimize the amount of conflict and violence that might happen. So maybe today's police should take some lessons from that.
Yeah, if I can just interject, I mean, my memory of it was being quite well organized, with state police standing there between the protesters and the counter protesters, and buses there to take protesters off to the armory, etc.
Yeah, I see someone mentioned in the chat. What about the movie Hairspray, John Waters and Hairspray? So you probably all have seen Hairspray, but he took a lot of liberties with the story. It was sort of based on Gwynn Oak, but the specifics of how the protest happens in Hairspray had nothing to do with the way that the protest happened in real life, and also the other part of his story with the dance program where the protesters staged a interracial dance-in at the Buddy Dean show, and in the movie Hairspray, at the end, it all ends happily, and the dance show integrates well. In real life, the Buddy Dean show, they got death threats, and it was taken off the air. It was the end of the Buddy Dean show. So John Waters was trying to have a happy ending, but it was no happy ending for the Buddy Dean show. So, but I really think the Hairspray conveys the feeling of Baltimore at that time. It really did give you a sense of being back there in those days.
There was just a little bit of trivia about the demonstration and arrests that I recall over the years, and it's simply being stuck in the armory for what seemed like weeks and weeks. I think for some reason I have 3 o'clock in the morning in my head. I don't know why I would have remembered, but I know we were in there for a long, long time, and the three of us kids were suffering from being up. We thought it was great to be up late until about 11 or something, and then we were suffering terribly having to stay up, and while everybody got fingerprinted, and they didn't fingerprint us, which I sort of regret at this point. But one thing that did happen was that we were peering out the grated windows with the bars on the windows of the armory, and there were reporters out there yelling to us. And one reporter asked what I thought was, "Are you Jim Coleman?" And I said, "No." And then I realized what he was asking. Of course, not was I Jim Coleman, but was I one of the sons of Jim Coleman? And I realized my brief chance at fame and fortune had been passed by misunderstanding what he had asked. So they did hand us, I think they handed us hot dogs through the window. I may have that wrong, and maybe Tom remembers correctly, but I think we got hot dogs handed to us through the window, through the bars.
So this has been just a really wonderful experience here, hearing not only from Amy and getting the historical context and the literary side, getting multiple youth audiences represented, but also hearing from the folks here in the public. So I want to thank Amy especially, and Sharon for her contributions, despite not being able to be with us this evening, and for all of you for joining us, and everything that's been contributed to the conversation. I do want to give a brief shout out to our sponsors with Baltimore City Historical Society. We're able to put on this free programming virtually and hopefully again in person sometime soon with the support of some of our sponsors, including Trace Architects and Arcadia Publishing. So very, very thankful for them for making that happen. And the history evenings will continue this season. We'll have 2 more coming up. You can find all of that information at Baltimore City Historical Society.org. But I'll also show here the next couple that are coming up, which will be also very interesting. Professor Jean Lee Cole from Loyola University will be sharing about the Women's Literary Club of Baltimore, really fascinating organization from the turn of the century. That'll be our May 20th program, also a Thursday evening. And then on June 17th, our final program of the season, which Mike Franch actually mentioned very early on in the program, will be coming from the Arnold Prize Award winner, John Tillman. His presentation, The Show of Strength Such as Seldom Seen, Blockbusting in Black Electoral Politics in 1950s Baltimore West Side. So not even too disconnected from some of the history that we've learned about and gotten context on this evening. So again, I just want to thank everybody for participating. Not to put you on the spot, but of course, any final words for us, Amy, or any other plugs you want to give?
No,
Folks can find your books. They can find your books anywhere, of course, I assume.
Yeah. Any bookstore can order them, and yeah, I'm so glad that you invited us. It's just been so moving to hear all these comments from people here, and thank you for having these histories. It's really important to learn that history, as one of the women said. That's what we need to deal with this history, unpleasant and hard as it is. We have to deal with it and try to finally overcome it. So thank you very much.
All right, so thanks everyone, and we hope to see you at our May event. I dropped an email address in there to register. It's baltohistoryeve@gmail.com. So let us know if you'd like to attend. And again, thank you all for being here and sharing your stories with us tonight.
All right.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.